Hi everyone and welcome back to another lab. In our previous lab, we have explored how to configure IPv6 statically or manually. However, in this lab, we are going to explore Stateless Address Autoconfiguration, or another word, SLAAC. This is a method used to automatically configure IPv6 addresses on a network interfaces without the need for manual intervention, and it relies on the use of router advertisements that are sent periodically by routers on the network. So, what I will be doing now is that I'm going to go through the objective of the lab and then go through the topology with you, then briefly cover the lab tasks and then go through the configuration steps. Okay, so let's start with the objective of this lab. So the objective is to configure and verify IPv6 addressing on routers and PCs by using SLAAC method. We will need to make sure that router 1 is able to push IPv6 address across all other devices in the network apart from these two switches, what you see on the screen here. Regarding the topology, what you see on the screen is the topology that we'll be using throughout this lab. And what you see on the screen is that we have four different PCs. We have PC1, PC2 that are attached to switch 1, whereas PC3, PC4, they are attached to switch 2. Switch 1 and switch 2 are then connected to router 1, and router 1 is then connected to router 2. And router 1 is the main router where is going to produce the SLAAC auto configuration to router 2, as well as PC1, PC2, PC3, and PC4. With that being said, I'm going to go through the lab task. And if I scroll a little bit down, we can see that the lab task has been set accordingly. The first one is to obviously create the lab, connect the devices according to the topology. And the second task is where we are going to connect to each router via the CLI and being able to change the host name according to the topology. If we would then move to the third step, we can see that we would need to enable IPv6 routing on both routers, router 1 and router 2. And then we move from step 3 to step 4, where we are going to enable and configure IPv6 on each interface on router 1 that is connected to a network device. For example, we have switch 1, switch 2, as well as router 2. And we will have to obviously look at the IPv6 address table to configure each interface accordingly. We then move to step number 5, where we can verify that each interface is in the up state and has been configured with the appropriate IPv6 configuration. We then move to step number 6, where we are going to enable and configure SLAAC with the IPv6 autoconfig on router 2, as well as PC1, PC2, PC3, and PC4. We then verify that interface gig Ethernet 002 is enabled and configured automatically with IPv6. We then set IPv6 configuration on all the PCs automatically rather than statically. Once we've done that, we can then verify that each PC has an IPv6 address that is being auto-configured. We will then check connectivity between every PC and the router 1 interfaces. We then check connectivity between every PC and the router 1 interfaces. We will then verify that each PC is able to ping the other PCs on the network. Once we're comfortable with everything, we can then go ahead and save the configurations. Okay, so before we jump into the configuration steps, so if you look at the video description, you will see that I set the lab instructions so that you can go ahead and challenge yourself at your own pace. I also created a lab document for you to go ahead and download it so that you can challenge yourself by building the lab and go through the list of tasks on your own and whenever you need to. I also have included the lab setup ready to go for you to configure, and you will see that I included a couple of labs. The first one is the pre-configuration, and the second one is the post-configuration. Okay, cool. So now is the right moment for you to go and pause the video to go through the task yourself. Otherwise, let's get on with it. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the list of tasks, and the first one is already been done, and the second one is we're going to configure the host name on each of our devices on the network. So I'm going to start with router 2. So if I click on it and then click on the CLI and then hit enter and hit enable and then config terminal, and then from there I can change the host name from router to router 2. Once I've done that, I'll just minimize the window and jump into router 1 CLI and do the same thing. I would say config terminal, and then I would say host name router 1. Minimize this window, do the same thing for switch 1, hit enter and then enable and then config terminal. And then from here I can say switch 1, minimize this, and finally do switch 2. Okay, so step number 2 is complete. If I then go to step number 3, where I'm going to enable IPv6 routing on both routers, so I'll go back to router 1. And then I would say, since I'm in config mode already, what I can do, I can say IPv6 unicast routing and do the same thing for router 1. IPv6 unicast routing. So that is step number 3. Then what we are going to do, we are going to configure each interface on router 1 according to the according to the IPv6 address table. So I will start with the Ethernet 000. So I'll say interface Ethernet 0/0/0, and what I'll do, I will say IPv6 enable, and then I will say IPv6 address, and then I'm going to paste that IPv6 address, which is in the IPv6 address table. I will hit enter, and then I will say no shutdown. So that will actually enable the interface. So I'll just go back to my router. From there, I can go to interface gig Ethernet 0/0/1, and then I'll just copy the IPv6 address. First of all, I will just enable IPv6, and then I would say IPv6 address and paste the IPv6 address from the IPv6 address table. And I would say no shot as well. Then I'll just up arrow multiple times to get the same command, which is interface gig Ethernet 001, and then I'm going to change 1 to 2. And then again, I will up arrow multiple times to get the IPv6 enable command. And then finally, we are going to configure the IPv6 address on the interface. I'll say IPv6 address and then paste the IPv6 address. And then I would say no shutdown. So step number 4, we have managed to enable the interfaces on router 1. We also configured each interface with IPv6 address. And now what we can do, we can then verify the configurations. And we can do that by saying, since I am in the interface config mode, do show IPv6 interface and then brief. And you can see that 000 or gig Ethernet 000 is configured with this IPv6 address. And similarly with 001 is configured with this IPv6 address. And finally, with Gig Ethernet 002 is configured with this IPv6 address. Every interface is in the up state, apart from Gig Ethernet 002. And the reason being is because the other side of the link is still admin down. So we would need to go ahead and configure the other side as well. So step number 5, that is complete. Now we can go ahead and tackle step number 6. So if I go ahead and minimize this and go back to router 2 CLI, and from there I can say interface gig ethernet 0/0/2. And what I'll do, I'll say IPv6 enable, and to enable autoconfig, I would need to say IPv6 address autoconfig. And finally, I would need to enable the interface, which I'm going to say no shutdown. And now the interface is up. So if I do the same thing where I say show IPv6 interface brief, then that should be that. So you can see here that the IPv6 address has already been populated, as you can see on the screen, under interface gig ethernet 002, and the status of the interface is in the up state. And now if I try to ping this, if I say end and then say ping, and I'm going to go, actually what I can do, so I will copy this IPv6 and I would paste this IPv6 address and I would hit enter, and you can see that the ping is successful. So now what we can do is we can move to step number 8, where we are going to set IPv6 configuration on each of the PCs automatically. So minimize the window and then go to PC1, go to desktop, and then from there what I can do, I can, under the IPv6 configuration, we need to set the settings to automatic. Now you can see that the IPv6 has been already populated automatically here, but what we can do, we can actually verify that by going to the CLI of the PC, and then from there we can say ipconfig, and what you see is under IPv6 address, you can see that this IPv6 address has been assigned automatically to PC1. If I then try to ping the gateway, just to verify that there is connectivity between PC1 and the default gateway, for instance, you can see that the ping is successful. I will minimize that and then I will jump into PC2. I'll go to desktop and then under the IPv6 configuration, set that to automatic, and then close this and then open up the CLI and then issue the ipconfig, and you can see that the IPv6 address has been populated accordingly. I will minimize that. I will jump into PC3, do the same thing, go to IP configuration, set that to automatic, close this, verify that, and I would say IP config, and you can see that the IPv6 address has been populated as well. Finally, we go to PC4 and then go to desktop, do the same thing, set the IPv6 configuration to automatic, close this, go back to command to the CLI and say ipconfig. And in here we can see that the IPv6 has been populated successfully on PC4. So we have tackled step number 8, where we did set the IPv6 configuration on all of the PCs. We also have verified that each PC has IPv6 address that is being auto-configured. And then now we can jump into step number 10, where we are going to check connectivity between every PC and router's one interface. So what I'll do, so we already checked this by pinging the IPv6 address that is being assigned on the gig ethernet 001 interface on router 1. And what I can do, I can try to ping the other interface, which is going to switch number 2. So I'm going to say ping, and I will set the IPv6 address, which is associated to gig Ethernet 001. I will hit enter, and you can see that there is connectivity and reachability. I will also do the same for the third interface. Let's say ping, and ping that IPv6, and you can see that we can reach gig Ethernet 002. Now we can see that PC1 is able to reach router 1, or all the interfaces on router 1. And now we can move into PC number 2, and we do the same thing. You can see that I was able to ping the gig Ethernet 002 interface on router 1. We'll do the same with the interface gig Ethernet 001, and I will paste the IPv6 address, and you can see that there is reachability. And then finally, I will do the same with gig Ethernet 001. So let's say ping, paste that, hit enter. You can see that I have reachability and connectivity between PC1 and PC2 with router 1. Next, we're going to do the same thing with PC3. So say ping IPv6 address, and we get a successful ping. Do the same thing for gig Ethernet 001. Again, we get successful ping. And finally is pinging the gig Ethernet 002. So I will hit enter, and you can see that the ping is actually successful. And then finally we go to PC4 and repeat the same thing. So that's pinging, that's PC4 is being able to ping routers 1 gig Ethernet 002, which is successful. Do the same thing for 001. Ping this IPv6 address, and we get successful ping. And then finally we ping Ethernet 000, and we get successful ping. Now we are going to verify that each PC is able to ping the other PCs as well. So I'm going to start with PC1. So what I'll do, I'll just do this. And then from here, I can grab the IPv6 address that belongs to PC2, copy it, and then paste it on PC1 CLI. Hit enter, and you can see that we have reachability between PC1 and PC2. Now if I do the same with PC3, if I go all the way up and copy this, sorry, not this one, copy IPv6 address and try to ping PC3, we also get successful ping. I would do the same thing for PC4. So if I scroll all the way up and then copy IPv6 address that has been auto-generated and say ping this IPv6 address, and you can see that the ping is actually successful, and we have successfully configured SLAAC auto-configuration across our topology. Now that all PCs are able to ping each other, we have successfully completed the lab. At this point, what we can do, we can go back to router 1 and router 2 and say WR to save the configuration, or copy running startup, and that saves the config. If we go back to router 2, I can issue WR for writing or saving the configuration, or copy running startup config. That will save the configuration, and that finalize the lab tasks. that we have for this topology or for this lab. Okay, that's it folks for this video. If you found this video helpful, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our future tutorials and tech insights. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to drop a comment below. I read all your comments and I'm here to assist you. Remember, consistency and hands-on practice are key to success. Stay curious, stay inspired, and until next time, peace.